Mike is going to give us a talk, Pollution Contingency Planning and Response Overview. Mike is the 8th Coast Guard District Incident Management and Preparedness Advisor, and we'll tell you more as I get his slides up there.
So good morning, everyone. Pleased to be here today. And let me start first by acknowledging NOAA and specifically their Sea Grant program. Coast Guard's had a long history of close collaboration with NOAA through the Scientific Support Coordinator component for 40 plus years. But here in the last few years, had the distinct pleasure of working with Sea Grant on other workshops and outreach efforts. And again, very, very pleased to be invited to provide you an overview of what currently exists. We find out as we go along that some people may not fully understand or recognize the system and the processes that are in place nationally, regionally, and down at the local level. So I'm going to cover that here in less than 30 minutes. So a little bit about myself. I am a full-time civilian employee with the 8th Coast Guard District that's located in New Orleans. And I am retired active duty Coast Guard person for 29 years. I retired to take this great job. This is one of the benefits or the positives that came out of the Deepwater Horizon response was each Coast Guard district got one civilian incident management and preparedness advisor. So there's 9 Coast Guard districts. So I'm happy to be here in the center of the Gulf of Mexico. I'm going to give you a brief overview, very brief, about the Coast Guard for those of you that may not be familiar. All these people in blue here, there may be a pop quiz at some point. We're going to talk about authorities, we're going to talk to the National Response System and the different components, talk about post-Deepwater Horizon incident improvements, talk about the Preparedness for Response Exercise Program guidelines, which means if there's not something actively going on in a oil or hazardous substance incident, then we have an exercise program that we use to test existing policy plans and procedures. And of course, coming back to talking about the difference between the National Contingency Plan-led response as opposed to Stafford Act, which is your natural disaster declaration. Opportunities to collaborate. I would be remiss if I didn't provide you what I think I know about what's coming up here within the 8th District. And then key takeaways. So if you zone out on everything that I see, that last slide will bring it all to home. All right, quickly. That's a national map. And does this have is the center the, yes. Okay. One Coast Guard. Our headquarters is in Washington, D.C. We have 2 areas. Okay, this is Atlantic area, and this is Pacific area. Those headquarters are in Portsmouth, Virginia for the Atlantic area, and Alameda, California, basically San Francisco, California for the Pacific area. There are 9 Coast Guard districts, and of course I'm going to focus on the 8th district, which is right here. It is the largest. It's all parts of 26 states from border to border. And we go out to 200 miles to the exclusive economic zone and our maritime boundary with Mexico, our partner to the south. Within that, we also have a National Strike Force. We have a National Strike Force Coordination Center out of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and 3 strike teams. The Atlantic Strike Team in Fort Dix, New Jersey, the Gulf Strike Team in Mobile, Alabama, and the Pacific Strike Team in Novato, California. So that's what it looks like from a national perspective. Now within the Gulf of Mexico, the next level down you have headquarters, areas, and then Coast Guard districts. Underneath that is where the work is really done. And that's at field commands. Most of them are broken up by captain of port zones, but we do have some field units that don't have their own captain of port authority, but they're working under a unit that does have captain of port authority and other authorities, jurisdictions, responsibilities. And here in the Gulf of Mexico, all of these are not in the 8th District, by the way, but here's the line. Oh. So from Mobile, New Orleans, Houma, Port Arthur, Houston, Galveston, and Corpus Christi, those 6 captain of the port zones, those are in the 8th District. But just to round out the Gulf of Mexico, here's the boundary between the 7th District and the 8th District. So you have Sector St. Petersburg and Key West in the 7th District, headquartered out of Miami. So that's kind of what the Gulf of Mexico looks like, and I'll talk about the importance of the Cabinet of the Port zones and authorities a little bit later. So at the national level, we're talking about pollution, planning, preparedness, and response. We're talking oil, hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. There's two main laws that give the Environmental Protection Agency and the Coast Guard and everyone else, not everyone else, but those two agencies primarily, their authority to do the planning, preparedness, and response to those incidents. One on the left is Clean Water Act, which was most recently updated by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, 28 years ago. And then for hazardous substances, you have the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, or Superfund. So that is the hazardous materials regulations, or actually the statute. Those are the laws, all right, so that lays the overarching national framework, and underneath that you have regulations that enact various portions of those two statutes. What I'm going to talk about primarily today is the National Contingency Plan and basically pollution planning, preparedness, and response. And that is located in 40 Code of Federal Regulation, Part 300. That's the National Contingency Plan. Which, that's a little screenshot. So, who owns the National Contingency Plan? Correct, the Environmental Protection Agency. All right, so the President delegated down to the EPA way back when to say, EPA, you own these regulations. Okay, so that's how the system works. I'm going to go into next talking about the National Response System. That basically talks about, it's all inclusive. You have federal, you have regional, state, local entities that make up the entire national response system. And that system is how we conduct pollution planning, preparedness, and response. Here's some of the key components, and most of these I'm going to talk about a little bit further in my overview presentation. We're going to talk about the National Response Center. That's the one call, that's all, not to take a local pun from a TV commercial here, but that's the 24/7. If you forget all the other numbers, 800-424-8802, that's the National Response Center. They handle all reports of pollution nationwide. Inland, coastal zone, doesn't matter when, where. That is located at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C., and it is staffed by Coast Guard active duty and civilian personnel. That doesn't mean that the Coast Guard owns the National Response Center. That is a component of the National Response Team, all those 15 federal agencies that I'm going to talk about here briefly. But the Coast Guard is their portion of the overall piece. We agreed years ago to house that at Coast Guard headquarters and staff it. So that is our contribution to that intergovernmental call center, basically, is what it is. We'll talk about the National Response Team. Underneath that, the regional response teams and the differences between those. And talk about the importance of federal on-scene coordinators. Now, if you picked up the National Contingency Plan right now, you wouldn't see federal on-scene coordinator. Because the last time the National Contingency Plan was updated was, I believe, in 1997-ish, and it still lists on-scene coordinator. So you will see that in my slides. But just know at the federal level, those are interchangeable. You also have state on-scene coordinators, so on and so forth. The baseline, the foundation from which all work is developed for pollution planning, preparedness, and response at the area committee level. And that is chaired in the coastal zone by those Coast Guard captain of the ports throughout the country in the coastal zone. EPA is the chair of inland area committees. Okay? That's a key distinction. And I will say this now, that some people, when you hear that the area committee is the foundation, they go, well, wait a minute, Mike, what about the local emergency planning committees, LEPCs? That's a great point. And in the National Contingency Plan, it does draw that correlation that the area committees and that area contingency plan needs to be in sync with any local emergency plan that is developed and maintained. Talk about state, local governments, special teams. I mentioned one earlier, actually two. The NOAA Scientific Support Coordinator, they are listed as a special team within the National Contingency Plan. They are available to provide assistance. The Coast Guard's National Strike Force, those are special teams. They're not only for the Coast Guard, they're for the EPA and anyone else that's on the National Response Team as they are requested, needed, wanted. Joint response teams, we border with Mexico, so we do have an international joint contingency plan with Mexico. It's called MEXIS, and within the Gulf of Mexico, we have a regional annex referred to as the MEXIS Gulf Annex. And of course, regulated industry. So all of those components, from national down to the local level, are part of the national response system. Pretty impressive, huh? Now the NRT, the National Response Team. You can read that if you want, but here's the takeaway. Under the statute and in accordance with those regulations, 40 CFR Part 300, the National Contingency Plan, the EPA, a person at EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., they are designated as the chair of the National Response Team. The Coast Guard fills the role as vice chair. Who makes up the National Response Team? 15 federal agencies or departments. Those entities make up the National Response Team, again, led by the Environmental Protection Agency. Of course, they don't respond per se. They provide that overarching national guidance, policy, and are there to support either at the regional level or at the local level during time of response. They were actively involved in Deepwater Horizon that happened 8.5 years ago. All right, underneath the National Response Team, you have 13 regional response teams. And very, very similar to the National Response Team, yet different. Here's the key differences. One, at the regional level, it's a co-chair responsibility between the EPA and the Coast Guard. And part of my role and my colleagues' role in their respective Coast Guard district is we serve as the co-chair for regional response teams. So for the 8th district, I'm responsible with my EPA colleagues to co-chair RRT 6, 7, and 8. So if you look at the map, oh man, I did it again. 6, 7, and 8. But we do have 8 Coast Guard district units that are within 3, 4, and 5. So there's a lot of activity here in the middle of the country, and that's how it's broke down. So it's a co-chair responsibility, so equal, and also at the regional level, in addition to the 15 federal agencies or departments, it also includes the states within the region. So if we're talking about Region 6 here, since we're in Louisiana, the coastal states of Louisiana and Texas are in Region 6. And again, we don't respond, we provide regional level policy guidance and support to federal on-scene coordinators during time of response. So within that, this is a slide out of the National Contingency Plan. It kind of breaks down, so what is out there? And what is out there, of course, at the top is the National Contingency Plan. Underneath that, each region has its own regional contingency plan. And then here, remember I said this is the foundation. So Captain of Ports with Captain of Port Authority, and here in the 8th District, coastal zone, we're talking for Louisiana, I will say, we have Sector New Orleans, we have Marine Safety Unit Homa, we have Marine Safety Unit Port Arthur, and we have Sector Houston Galveston and Sector Corpus Christi. So those different field commands in Louisiana and Texas, they have capital port authority, and per the National Contingency Plan, they are charged with being the chair of the area committees in the coastal zone, working closely with state, other federal, state, local entities to develop area contingency plans. Okay, area contingency plans are important. And a lot of other plans that are required by law and or regulation, let's say facility response plans over here, vessel response plans, offshore, the Gulf of Mexico Outer Continental Shelf with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE, under the Department of the Interior, for the oil and gas exploration and production. All of those oil spill response plans, those are supposed to be coordinated with, in sync with the respective area contingency plans. So there's a lot of activity here. You have other federal plans, state and local plans, all funnels into the area contingency plan. So that is the foundation. And of course here in the Gulf of Mexico, we have that joint plan, international, with Mexis. Mexis is that national umbrella plan, but there are two regional annexes, one in the Pacific, Mexis PAC, and then of course the Gulf of Mexico, the Mexis Gulf Annex. And for the later on conversation about the differences between the National Contingency Response as opposed to Stafford Act, we do acknowledge that you've got the National Response Framework up there in the top right. So all of those are the various plans that are in place by law, regulation. Different entities own the responsibility of developing, exercising, and implementing, activating those plans during a real incident. But they're all notionally synchronized, and it starts at the area committee level. You know, the area contingency plan, those are just some of the key components within. And again, this is out of the statute. So Oil Pollution Act of 1990 did update the Clean Water Act and prescribe various things to improve the processes, right? Because Exxon Valdez happened in March of 1989 and things didn't go as well as people thought that they should have gone. So that really pushed Congress to update that law. One thing I want to focus on is really it does talk about dispersant use. You'd ask area committees to consider that. You know, is this a viable option for you? Are you interested in doing that? And what are the procedures, the process for getting to a yes or no determination? All area contingency plans are tasked with planning for the worst case discharge. So the worst case discharge, I'll just say before Deepwater Horizon occurred, we were pretty good in the Coast Guard, in the coastal zone, our area contingency plans by having the worst case discharges acknowledged by complete loss of a vessel. What we failed to adequately incorporate was all of that offshore oil and gas exploration and production in the Gulf of Mexico. That was not synced up within our plans. That has been a process improvement post Deepwater Horizon. And the big component, the most value added, arguably, is this annex listed in the National Contingency Plan, the Fish and Wildlife Sensitive Environments Plan. So that is where you talk about what's in the area as far as potentially federally listed threatened or endangered species, critical habitat, things to know and to plan for in advance of an actual incident. How does it all work? When something happens in the United States, like a lot of countries, we operate by the polluter pays principle. Basically, the responsible party. If you are the owner, operator, person in charge of a vessel, onshore, offshore facility, if you have a discharge, then the law states that you have to report it to the National Response Center, and you have to take all actions to mitigate that pollution incident, period. So some of you may have heard early on into the Deepwater Horizon response, some people were questioning, why is BP at the table? Why is BP part of this process? Why? Because the law says they're supposed to be part of the process. So that's a key thing that a lot of people don't necessarily get. They think that when something happens, then the feds take over and the feds clean it up, and the bad operator, if you will, you had an incident happen, then you have to sit on the sideline. That's not the case. We want them at the table. They're part of Unified Command, and we're working jointly with them to make sure that the incident is taken care of. So you have incident occurs, make the 24/7 report, and then that gets funneled out to the respective on-scene coordinator, the pre-designated federal on-scene coordinator, be it in the coastal zone, Coast Guard, or inland zone, the Environmental Protection Agency. And that actual boundary between coastal and inland zone is negotiated between EPA region and the Coast Guard, pretty much outlined by the Coast Guard district. So that's where that comes from. And you make notification to the natural resource trustees, and then you determine if a federal response is necessary. Oftentimes a federal response is not necessary because the responsible party made notification and they're taking all necessary actions to mitigate that pollution incident. So the Coast Guard or EPA may provide some federal oversight just to make sure that it gets done, but we're not heavy-handed in that. We want the responsible parties to be responsible in accordance with the law. And then down here, I talked about this, is that somewhat of a triangle, but it's not necessarily limited to 3 or 4. It's that on-scene coordinator from the federal level, you have the responsible party, and you have the state or states involved. You can have local entities part of the Unified Command. Sometimes it works, other times that all of those local concerns are funneled through that one state on-scene coordinator. And then again, you have the regional response teams and the national response teams over here on the left to oversee and to provide support to that on-scene coordinator as necessary throughout the response. So that's graphically how it all works, when it works. Okay, when everything is quiet, we have exercise requirements. Now, what you have in front of you is called the Preparedness for Response Exercise Program Guidelines. So it's not law, it's not regulations, it's not a have to, it is a guideline. But I don't know of anybody who has not adopted the PrEP guidelines in their own entity's exercise program. Owners, operators, basically industry could adopt their own, they could develop their own requirements per the regulation and law, but everyone just adopts the PrEP guidelines. And the big takeaway here is that is 37 different exercise types, 6 different response plans for 4 federal agencies. And those agencies that develop and sign off on these national level preparedness for response exercise program guidelines is the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Coast Guard, and under Department of Transportation, you have the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, and for the Department of the Interior, you have the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE, for that offshore oil and gas exploration and production component. So those are the 4 federal agencies that work to maintain this document. Okay, so why do we do National Contingency Plan as opposed to Stafford Act? How many local entities do we have here today? Local? No one? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Anyone from local emergency management, potentially? No? Okay. Well, if you talk to an emergency management person at Louisiana at the parish level or in other states at the county level, they will say they live by the Stafford Act. You have incidents that occur, whether it be flooding, wind damage, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, whatever. If it exceeds the local capabilities, they go to the state. States have emergency management compacts. They support each other to mitigate those damages. And if it exceeds the state's capabilities, then the governor will submit or declare an emergency and ask for a federal declaration. let's take a hurricane, for example. So all of that is predicated on the Robert T. Stafford Act. It prescribes how a local government can go up through the process to get access to assistance to mitigate damage assessment. The National Contingency Plan equally outlines a different response process. It's always available, and again, if you observe something at the local level, you can just pick up the phone and call that 24/7 National Response Center line and get action if the responsible party is unwilling, unable to start a response. So those are key things. Of course, FEMA leads the Stafford Act. The EPA or the Coast Guard is overall federal on-scene coordinator for a pollution response under the National Contingency Plan. There is no cost share for National Contingency Plan. There is usually a cost share for the states for Stafford Act, and the entering argument right now is 25%. So there are distinct differences. They can both coexist, but you just need to be in the conversation and making sure that we are all working together in the same direction. Some of the improvements, we've updated our plans throughout. The National Response Team did come out with environmental monitoring for atypical dispersant operations, some guidance for monitoring for subsea dispersant use. There's been improvements for natural resource damage assessments. Of course, here in the Gulf, capping stack and cap and flow technology did not exist pre-Deepwater Horizon. The capping stack was what finally stopped the discharge after 87 days for Deepwater Horizon. So a lot of activity has taken place over the last several years, and we have made some good improvements. So coming up for you for your consideration, at the end of this week, nearby, there's the South Central Louisiana Area Committee meeting on Friday the 7th of December. And some of these other items here, both at the local level and at the regional level. Because I understand that if you wanted to plug in at the foundation level, that would be going to the area committees. But understanding that people are busy and limited travel dollars and time, there is an opportunity to also plug in at the regional response team level as well. In Region 6, we have semi-annual meetings, usually in May and November in Texas. So I'm not going to go through these dates right now, but everyone's going to have access to these slides after the fact. And if anyone has any questions or comments, you can definitely see me. So here we are. Key takeaways, we do have a system in place. So if you didn't learn anything, then that's fine. But I want to make sure that everyone understands here today that there is a defined system in place, law, regulations, and various policy plans and procedures. You have a lot of entities that are responsible for pollution planning, preparedness, and response. You do have an option for participation, area committee level, or again at the regional response team level. And I want to drive home the point that the Coast Guard is not always in charge of pollution planning, preparedness, and response, nor is the EPA. But the EPA is in charge within the inland zone, and the Coast Guard is in charge for the coastal zone. And I am your point of contact for any questions, comments, issues, or concerns. I will be here pretty much all day today. I won't be able to be with you tomorrow, but that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.